the kamikaze pilot who chose not to die. The sound of a Mitsubishi Zero's engine cuts through the pre-dawn darkness over Mabalacat airfield in the Philippines. It is October 1944, and the air smells of aviation fuel and something else. Fear masked as devotion, doubt wrapped in ceremony. Lieutenant Yukio Seki sits in his cockpit, 23 years old, newly married for barely 10 months. Strapped beneath his aircraft is a 250-kilogram bomb. He will not be coming back. At least, that is what everyone expects. But before we understand why Seki returned to base 4 times before his final mission, 4 times when he should have died and didn't, we must first understand how an entire nation convinced its young men that death was more honorable than life. By autumn of 1944, Japan is bleeding. The Imperial Navy has lost the Battle of Midway, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and most recently, the catastrophic Battle of Leyte Gulf. American forces are advancing with overwhelming industrial might. More ships, more planes, more ammunition than Japan can ever hope to match. The situation is not just dire, it is mathematically impossible. In the corridors of Imperial headquarters in Tokyo, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi looks at the numbers and sees only one solution. Conventional warfare has failed. Conventional pilots, even skilled ones, are being shot down at rates that make victory impossible. But if every plane becomes a guided missile, if every pilot becomes a living bomb, then perhaps, just perhaps, Japan can inflict enough damage to force a negotiated peace. The plan is not called suicide. That word would be too honest, too ugly. Instead, they call it special attack, Tokubetsu Kogekitai, shortened to Tokko. The pilots are told they will become heroes. They are told they will save Japan. They are told that to die for the emperor is the ultimate fulfillment of the samurai spirit, a tradition reaching back centuries. What they are not told is that this is desperation dressed up as honor. Seki Yukio did not volunteer for this. Almost none of them did, despite what the propaganda would later claim. He was an experienced pilot, a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, skilled enough that he should have been kept as an instructor. But skill makes you valuable in a different way when your military has decided that planes work better with men who never pull out of the dive. When his commanding officer first approached him about leading the kamikaze unit, Seki's response was recorded by those who were present. He did not salute smartly and declare it an honor. Instead, he said something much more human, much more devastating. If they order me to do it, I will do it. But it is not an easy thing to die that way. The pressure on these young men was not merely military, it was total. It was cultural, psychological, spiritual, and social, applied with the weight of 3,000 years of Japanese history. In the training camps for the special attack units, the atmosphere was strange. Part military base, part monastery, part funeral. The pilots wrote their death poems, following the tradition of samurai preparing for battle. They were given ceremonial headbands, hachimaki, emblazoned with the rising sun. They posed for final photographs in full flight gear, knowing these images would be sent to their families as relics. Every ritual reinforced the same message: you are already dead. What remains is only the manner of your dying. The ideology behind the kamikaze program reached back to Bushido, the way of the warrior, though it was a twisted, militarized version of that ancient code. Traditional Bushido emphasized loyalty, courage, and honor, yes, but also wisdom and benevolence. What the imperial military sold to these pilots was something narrower and darker. Death as the only proof of devotion, suicide as the highest form of patriotism. They were told that Japan itself was divine, that the emperor was a living god, that to sacrifice oneself for the nation was to transcend death entirely and become a guardian spirit at Yasukuni Shrine, where Japan's war dead were enshrined and worshipped. Mothers were told to be proud that their sons would become gods. Families were told that to show grief was to dishonor the sacrifice. This was not a military strategy, this was a national religion of death. The training was brief. There was no time for the years of preparation that had once made Japanese naval aviators among the best in the world. New pilots received perhaps 3 months of instruction, sometimes less. They learned to take off and fly in formation. They learned basic navigation, but they did not learn to land properly because landing was not part of the mission profile. Instead, they practiced one maneuver over and over, the dive. Steep, controlled, accelerating toward a target at hundreds of kilometers per hour. The instructors taught them to aim for the waterline of a ship, or better yet, the base of the smokestack where the boilers were housed. A hit there would cause maximum damage. The explosion had to count, because there would be no second chance. In the barracks at night, the young pilots, many of them still teenagers, pulled from universities and technical schools, would lie awake and wonder what it would feel like. Would it be instant? Would there be pain? Would they feel the moment of impact, or would consciousness simply end like a lamp being switched off? Some wrote letters to their families, carefully censored, full of phrases about duty and honor that concealed their terror. Others wrote more honest entries in private diaries that would only be discovered decades later. One pilot, 19 years old, wrote, "I am afraid of dying. I do not want to die, but I am more afraid of being called a coward." That was the trap. The Kamikaze program did not run on fanaticism alone. It ran on shame. In Japanese society, particularly during the war years, the concept of shame, haji, was more powerful than almost any other social force. To bring shame upon your family, to be seen as lacking in courage or devotion, was considered worse than death itself. The Kamikaze program weaponized this cultural value with brutal efficiency. If you hesitated, you were a coward. If you questioned the mission, you were disloyal. If you survived when you were supposed to die, you had failed in the most fundamental way possible. The morning of a mission followed a ritual pattern. The pilots would wake early, often before dawn. They would bathe and put on clean uniforms, sometimes including the 1,000-stitch belt, seninbari, a strip of cloth into which 1,000 different women had each sewn a single stitch, meant to bring protection and courage. They would gather for a final meal, often including sake and special foods that were luxuries in wartime Japan. Then came the ceremony. Officers would give speeches about the importance of the mission. There would be toasts, photographs. Sometimes the pilots would be given small gifts to carry with them. Locks of hair from mothers, photographs of family, amulets from shrines. What these ceremonies actually accomplished was to make it impossible to back out. With every ritual, every speech, every salute, the social commitment deepened. To refuse now in front of your fellow pilots, your commanding officers, with the photographers present and the mechanics waiting by your plane, that would require a kind of courage that most young men, especially in that culture and that moment, simply did not possess. Seki and his unit took off from Mabalacat on the morning of October 25th. 5 Zeros, each carrying a bomb, each piloted by a man who was supposed to die before sunset. Their mission: find the American fleet off Samar and crash into the aircraft carriers. But here is what the history books often omit. Before that successful final mission, Seki had flown out on 4 previous sorties. 4 times he had taken off with the same orders, the same bomb, the same expectation that he would not return, and 4 times he came back. The official explanation was always the same: no targets found, visibility poor, enemy fleet not located. These were plausible reasons. The Pacific is vast, and locating ships without modern radar required luck as much as skill. But there were whispers. There were always whispers, because everyone knew that the vast Pacific could also be a kind of mercy. The pilot who claimed he could not find the enemy might be telling the truth. Or he might have seen the ships and turned away. Or he might have flown in a different direction entirely, burning fuel over empty ocean until his tanks were low enough that he had no choice but to return to base or ditch in the water. There was no way to prove it, and perhaps more importantly, no one wanted to prove it. Because if you started court-martialing kamikaze pilots for failing to die, what did that say about your military, your mission, your entire national strategy? The psychological state of a pilot approaching his target was captured in some of the letters and diaries that survived. The mind, it seems, does strange things in those final moments. Some men described a kind of calm, an acceptance that made the dive feel almost mechanical. Others described a roaring in their ears that drowned out thought entirely. A few described dissociation, as if they were watching themselves from outside their own bodies, observing the dive as spectators rather than participants. and some described the sudden, overwhelming surge of the survival instinct. One pilot who survived the war, not because he pulled away, but because his plane was so badly damaged by anti-aircraft fire that he crashed short of his target and was rescued, described the moment this way: "When I pushed the stick forward and began the dive, everything became very clear. I could see the ship getting larger. I could see men running on the deck. And then something inside me, something very old, very animal, began screaming that this was wrong, that I wanted to live, that I had to pull up. The body wants to survive. It does not care about honor. It does not care about the emperor. It only wants breath and heartbeat and tomorrow." For pilots like Seki, who returned multiple times, that inner scream must have been deafening. Imagine the physical experience. You are diving at 500 kilometers per hour. The ship grows in your windscreen. You can see the guns turning toward you, the tracers starting to arc up, bright and strangely beautiful. Your hands are locked on the stick. Your body is pressed back into the seat by acceleration. Every instinct, every nerve, every cell is screaming at you to pull up. And you are supposed to ignore all of that. You are supposed to keep the stick forward and fly straight into the steel. The moment of decision, the instant when a pilot chose to pull away instead of die, was almost never documented officially. These were not moments that commanders wanted recorded, or that the pilots themselves wanted to explain. But they happened. We know they happened because planes returned with full bomb loads still attached, because pilots gave contradictory reports, because occasionally someone saw. When a pilot pulled out of an attack dive at the last second, the physical strain on the aircraft was tremendous. The G-forces could buckle wings, snap control cables, or cause structural damage that made the plane barely flyable. Sometimes the bomb would tear free from its mounting and fall harmlessly into the ocean. Sometimes the engine, pushed beyond its limits, would seize or catch fire. The pilot who chose life in that moment often paid for it mechanically. His plane, half broken, would limp back toward base-burning oil, shedding pieces with fuel gauges pointing toward empty. These were not clean decisions. They were desperate, violent acts of survival that often led to crash landings, ditching in the ocean, or simply running out of fuel and falling from the sky on the way home. But even worse than the physical danger was what waited on the ground. The shame culture surrounding failed kamikaze missions was suffocating. When a pilot returned alive from a mission he was supposed to die completing, he entered a kind of social limbo. He was not quite a coward. After all, he had flown out, had faced the enemy. But he was also not a hero. He had not fulfilled his purpose. Other pilots would avoid eye contact. Officers would speak to him in clipped, formal tones. The propaganda machine had no use for survivors. The newspapers wanted death and glory, not awkward returns and mechanical failures. Some pilots who survived their first mission would be sent out again immediately, as if to give them a second chance to die properly. Others would be reassigned to ground duties, where they could feel the weight of unspoken judgment every day. A few, consumed by shame and unable to bear the social pressure, would volunteer for subsequent missions with an almost suicidal determination, as if to prove that their survival had been accident rather than choice. But the ones who truly understood what they had done, who recognized that they had chosen their own life over the nation's demand for their death, often carried a different kind of burden. Not shame exactly, but a complicated grief mixed with relief and guilt and defiance all at once. After the war, when the fog of propaganda finally lifted, many surviving kamikaze pilots, both those who had aborted missions and those whose aircraft had been damaged before they could attack, began to speak more openly about their experiences. What emerged from their testimonies was a portrait of young men who had been systematically manipulated by a military and government apparatus that viewed human life as ammunition. One survivor, speaking in the 1980s, described his feelings this way: "We were told that our deaths would save Japan. We believed it because we wanted to believe it, because we were young and we loved our country, and we could not imagine that our leaders would lie to us about something so fundamental. But Japan was not saved by our deaths. Japan was destroyed. We were wasted. And the men who ordered us to die, most of them survived." This realization was shattering. The ideology that had sustained the kamikaze program depended on the belief that the sacrifice was meaningful, that the deaths would alter the course of the war, that the divine wind would drive away the invaders just as it had centuries before during the Mongol invasions. But by late 1944, Japan's defeat was inevitable. The kamikaze attacks did sink ships and kill sailors. The USS St. Lo, struck by Seki, went down with significant loss of life. But they did not change the strategic reality. America's industrial capacity was too vast, its military too powerful, its will to win too strong. The kamikaze pilots died for nothing. Or rather, they died for a fantasy that their commanders either believed against all evidence or cynically promoted, knowing it was false. Seki's final mission on October 25th was successful, if that is the right word. He and his unit found the American escort carriers off Samar. The anti-aircraft fire was intense. Tracers filled the sky like deadly fireworks. One by one, the Zeros dove. Witnesses on the American ships reported that the first plane struck the St. Lo's flight deck and penetrated into the hangar bay where bombs and fueled aircraft were stored. The resulting explosion tore the ship apart from the inside. Within minutes, the carrier was listing badly. Within an hour, it sank. Seki did not survive to see it. His plane, along with his body, was consumed in the fireball of impact. He became the poster image of kamikaze sacrifice, the young, handsome officer who gave everything for Japan. His photograph appeared in newspapers. His wife received notification that he had died gloriously in battle. What the newspapers did not mention were the 4 previous missions he had flown and returned from. Those sorties disappeared from the official record, erased because they complicated the narrative, because they suggested that even the most celebrated kamikaze hero might have hesitated, might have struggled with the order to die. But those missions are perhaps the most important part of Seki's story. They are evidence that even in the most totalizing system of propaganda and social control, even when trained and indoctrinated and bound by honor and shame, human beings still resist their own annihilation. The decision to pull away from a dive, to choose survival in that split second, when everything, culture, duty, training, fear of shame, demands you continue, is an act of profound courage. It is the courage to defy not just orders, but an entire worldview. It is the courage to say, my life has value beyond what my nation demands of it. We will never know exactly what went through Seki's mind on those 4 missions when he returned alive. We cannot know if he saw ships and turned away, or if he genuinely could not find targets, or if some combination of circumstance and choice kept him alive until that final dawn when choice ran out. But we know he was human. We know he had doubts. His own recorded words before his first mission make that clear. It is not an easy thing to die that way. The other pilots who survived, who pulled away, who crashed on the way home, or ditched in the ocean, or landed with damaged planes and empty fuel tanks, these men lived with complicated legacies. In the immediate post-war years, as Japan struggled under occupation and attempted to process the trauma of defeat, there was little space for discussing the kamikaze program honestly. The subject was painful, shameful, confusing. Some survivors never spoke about their experiences at all. They returned to civilian life, found work, started families, and buried their war years deep where they did not have to examine them. Others struggled with what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares, flashbacks, survivors' guilt compounded by the knowledge that they had been ordered to die and had somehow refused. But gradually, as decades passed and Japan began to reckon more honestly with its wartime history, some of these men began to tell their stories. They spoke at schools, warning young people about the dangers of nationalism and propaganda. They gave interviews to historians, providing testimony that revealed the human reality behind the statistics and the mythology. One recurring theme in their accounts was the recognition of how thoroughly they had been manipulated. The 19-year-olds who had volunteered, or more accurately, who had felt they had no choice but to volunteer, looked back from the vantage point of old age and saw themselves as children. Children who had been taught that death was glorious, that individual life mattered less than national pride, that to question was to betray. They spoke about the propaganda films they had watched, showing kamikaze attacks as beautiful and noble. They spoke about the songs they had sung, celebrating sacrifice. They spoke about how completely the military had controlled information, ensuring that pilots never understood how badly the war was going, never realized that their deaths would change nothing. And they spoke about the moment, if they had experienced it, when survival instinct overcame ideology, when the body's desperate need for breath and heartbeat proved stronger than years of conditioning, when, just for an instant, they chose themselves over the empire. These testimonies are historically invaluable because they reveal what propaganda tries to hide, that human beings, even in the most extreme circumstances, retain some capacity for choice, that the will to live is powerful enough to overcome even the most sophisticated systems of social control, that young men who have been told their entire lives that honor requires death can still sometimes decide that life is worth the shame. The Kamikaze program claimed the lives of roughly 3,900 Japanese pilots and resulted in the sinking of approximately 36 Allied ships. In purely military terms, this was an unfavorable exchange rate. Japan could not afford to lose thousands of trained pilots, even if they inflicted significant damage. But the program was never purely military. It was theatrical. It was meant to demonstrate Japanese resolve, to terrify the enemy, to inspire the home population. What it actually demonstrated was how far a desperate nation will go when facing defeat, how willing governments are to spend their young people's lives, how easily noble-sounding words like honor and sacrifice can be weaponized to justify the unjustifiable. The Allied sailors who survived kamikaze attacks were traumatized by them. There is something uniquely horrifying about an enemy who uses himself as a weapon, who cannot be deterred by fear of death, because death is the objective. The psychological impact of these attacks rippled through the American fleet, creating a pervasive anxiety that any approaching plane might be a kamikaze. But the deeper trauma belonged to Japan, to the families who lost sons and brothers and fathers, to the survivors who carried guilt and shame, to a nation that had to eventually confront what it had asked of its children. In the decades after the war, attitudes toward the kamikaze program within Japan were complex and contentious. Some saw the pilots as tragic heroes, young men who had done their duty in impossible circumstances. Others saw them as victims of a militaristic government that had valued ideology over human life. Still others saw them as symbols of everything that had gone wrong during the war years. The ultranationalism, the rejection of rational strategy, the cult of death. Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, where the war dead are enshrined, became a focal point for these debates. To visit Yasukuni and honor the kamikaze pilots was, to some, a way of remembering sacrifice. To others, it was an endorsement of the militarism that had led to catastrophe. These debates continue today. What gets lost sometimes in these arguments is the individual human story. The young man in the cockpit, the moment of terror and choice, the impossible pressure of a culture that demands you die with a smile. Seki Yukio has been reduced to a symbol, the first official kamikaze hero. But before he was a symbol, he was a 23-year-old man who loved his wife, who had hoped to become a teacher after the war, who had dreams and fears and a future he wanted to live to see. The tragedy is not just that he died. The tragedy is that he was put in a position where death was framed as the only honorable option, where survival would have meant disgrace, where the fundamental human drive to continue living became something to be ashamed of. For the pilots who did survive, who turned away or crashed short, or were rescued from the ocean, their choice to live in a culture that demanded death was an act of quiet rebellion. It was not dramatic. There were no speeches, no public defiance, just the pulling back of a control stick, just the decision in one terrible instant that their life belonged to them and not to the state. These moments of refusal, scattered across the war, represent something essential about human nature. That even when propaganda is most powerful, even when social pressure is most intense, even when the consequences of disobedience are severe, some people will still choose life. They will still assert, through action if not words, that their existence has inherent value beyond what others demand of it. This is not to romanticize desertion or cowardice. Many of the pilots who returned did so for genuinely legitimate reasons: mechanical failures, inability to locate targets, battle damage. And many who completed their missions did so with genuine courage, facing death out of loyalty to comrades or belief in their cause. But the ones who turned away when they could have continued, those pilots remind us that obedience has limits, that there is a point where following orders becomes participation in your own murder, that choosing survival over duty in certain extreme circumstances is not weakness but wisdom. The cost of the Kamikaze program extended far beyond the 3,900 dead pilots. It cost Japan its moral credibility, revealed the bankruptcy of its military leadership, and contributed to the psychological devastation of the post-war years. It demonstrated to the world that Japan had become so desperate, so unmoored from rational strategy, that it was willing to systematically suicide its young men in a futile attempt to forestall inevitable defeat. And it cost the survivors, both the pilots who lived and the families who lost loved ones, decades of complicated grief, shame, anger, and confusion. How do you mourn someone who was killed by their own government's orders? How do you honor sacrifice that accomplished nothing? How do you live with the knowledge that you survived when you were supposed to die, when others did die, when the entire culture told you that survival was failure? These questions haunted post-war Japan and continue to resonate today whenever nations ask young people to die for abstract causes, whenever governments invoke honor and duty to justify military adventures, whenever propaganda systems try to override the basic human instinct for self-preservation. The Kamikaze program was an extreme case, but the underlying dynamic is universal. States will spend lives in pursuit of objectives that benefit those in power. They will dress this up in noble language. They will create systems of honor and shame that make refusal psychologically impossible. And they will count on young people's idealism, loyalty, and fear of social judgment to ensure compliance. What stands against this is the fragile, persistent human capacity to say no, to recognize manipulation even when it comes wrapped in patriotism, to value individual life even when surrounded by a culture of collective death, to choose, in the crucial moment, breath over glory, tomorrow over honor, life over the demands of a nation that sees its people as tools. Seki Yukio died on October 25, 1944. But before he died, he lived. He hesitated. He returned 4 times when he was supposed to die. In those returns, whether they were mechanical necessity or moral choice, lies a story more important than his celebrated death. Because his death is what the propaganda wanted. His death is what the military planned. His death is what the newspapers celebrated. But his survival, however temporary, was his own. Those 4 missions where he came back, those belonged to him, not to the emperor, not to the nation, not to history's demand for heroes and sacrifices. Those missions were evidence that even in the most extreme circumstances, even when trained and indoctrinated and socially bound, a human being can still resist, can still choose, can still live. And in that choice, repeated by dozens or hundreds of pilots across those final terrible months of the war, the choice to pull up, to turn away, to survive, lies something worth remembering. Not because it changes the outcome of battles or the verdict of history, but because it affirms something essential about being human. That we are more than what any nation, any ideology, any system of honor and shame tells us we must be. We are, first and last, alive. And that life, fragile, precious, temporary, is worth fighting for even when the entire world insists it should be surrendered. The kamikaze who chose not to die reminds us that there is always a choice. The choice may be impossible. It may cost everything. It may mean living with shame and judgment and the weight of others' expectations. But it is still a choice. And sometimes choosing life over duty, survival over sacrifice, your own tomorrow over someone else's vision of glory is the bravest thing a person can do. That is the story history tries to forget. But it is the story that matters most.